There was no NIST CSF.
There was a
NIST so NIST existed, right? So some older people are going to remember this. We had the orange book and we had the blue, like they were dictionary sized things that you use as this sort of governing mechanism to sort of help you understand. But you didn't really have, you use ISO. ISO was around, right?
Oh, right.
But ISO costs, yes, but ISO costs money, right? You had to pay to get access to the ISO controls to be able to, utilize them. And a lot of organizations didn't want to pay. They didn't understand. We didn't understand the value of having a control set to use as your baseline marker to build, your cyber program. So yeah, it was a very different world.
If you want to be a CISO today, you probably want to know what used to be a CISO's job 30 years ago. Let me explain. A lot of things that used to be a norm for us today are not something that used to be a norm 20, 30 years ago. The jobs of the CISOs or head of security back then have not really changed much, but the complexity and the challenges have. For this episode, we had Larry Whiteside Jr., who has been in the CISO space and cybersecurity space for a little over 30 years. He was kind enough to come in and talk about how to run a modern cloud security program in today's 2023 and maybe beyond world of cloud, API, compute, different services, and a lot more complexity. We spoke about when he started being a CISO, what it used to be like, and what were some of the challenges that they used to face, and how NIST CFA was not even a thing, and maybe governance compliance was not a thing either. So that was really fascinating for me. There was a lot of other things that he kind of called out were taken as a norm or the wild, wild west back in the day, if you were to just think about what happens now versus then. And we kind of went into the 2023 model. Like, how would you design a cloud security program, or specifically a cybersecurity program? What would be some of the bigger pillars around it? And what role would cloud security play in that? And how you can have an effective cloud security program, or at least work towards a path of a cloud security program, which is ready for 2023 and beyond as well. A little hint, being brave is the key, is what I would say for leaders who are listening, or probably who are trying to be the next CISOs. This is definitely a great episode for you. I hope you enjoy the conversation that we had with Larry Whiteside Jr. If you're watching or listening to this for the second or third time, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe, if you're watching on the video channels like LinkedIn or YouTube, or if you are listening on Apple or Spotify, definitely leave us a review or rating, as it helps the new guests who are coming in to know that you are finding this valuable and they should definitely come on the podcast. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and I'll see you on the next episode. Peace.
When you're developing an app, security might be treated as an afterthought. With functionality requirements and tight deadlines, it's easy to accidentally write vulnerable code or use a vulnerable dependency. But Snyk can help you secure your code in real time, so you don't need to slow down to build securely. Develop fast, stay secure. Good developer. Snyk.
Today's episode, I've got Larry Whiteside, who's equally stylish as I am, if I must say. And I'm going to bring him on stage so I can have him blush as I'm talking about it. He is very well stylized if you ever see him in person. Welcome, Larry, to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, man. I think it's always great to meet other people who are into men's fashion as well. And there are not that many in cybersecurity, so I'm glad I'm in good company.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey as I've, transitioned over the years. But yeah, there's not as many as you would think, should be or would be or could be into men's fashion and cyber.
Yeah. Well, hopefully people like you and I continue to inspire them, as you're inspiring them with your CISO work as well, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's been a fun journey. I happen to love what I do, so it makes it easy.
And maybe just in the same vein, for people, I guess I find it fascinating because you're currently a CISO, you've been a CISO in multiple companies before as well. What was kind of like your first CISO role? I'm always curious about the first one, because over the years, you obviously experienced a lot of things, but the first one I imagine is always very special. What was the, pathway to that?
Well, so, it's interesting. I've had this conversation a number of times, and one of the things I have to remind people is the term CISO was relatively new. I've been in this industry for 30 years, and so by title, the first CISO role, right, happened in the mid-2000s. But when you really look at the function of the CISO being the corporate cybersecurity leader, my first CISO role actually happened when I got out of the military, right? And so I wasn't named the CISO, it was named, head of information security. right? But it was, in fact, the CISO role. And so I did it for a nuclear naval agency when I had gotten out of the military and I resigned my commission. I'm a former Air Force officer. And so that was the first one. And it was interesting because it was a global role. I had, people in London and so forth. And it was different because this is me. That was my transition sort of out of the, Department of Defense into what was kind of private sector, but it wasn't because I was doing it for, a nuclear naval agency, which was still part of the Department of Defense. So it was a very interesting role, but it allowed me to sort of easily transition into true private sector later.
Interesting. And by the way, thank you for your service as well. And it's always awesome to meet other people who have been in the military. And so it seems like cybersecurity definitely attracts a lot of people from the military as well. So many of you folks are there. So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Well, it's a mindset, right? So, when you're in the military, they teach you integrity, they teach you leadership, they teach you a number of things that transition well into the field of cybersecurity in the private sector.
And talking about, I guess you did a program as a head of security for a nuclear program company, which is very interesting. I imagine just by itself, the challenges that an accident could basically mean a nuclear bomb going off, maybe some extreme example. But cloud was not like a thing back then. Cybersecurity programs, however, I don't know maybe to shed some light on this, what was cybersecurity programs like in that kind of era when pre-cloud was a thing, I guess, if that's the word we use, pre-cloud?
Yeah. So, back in the day, right, cybersecurity programs back then, it was really about infrastructure-based things, right? You had networks, you had a perimeter, and you had an interior, and you had all of the infrastructure that made those things up. And so a lot of it was about VPNs, right? How do you get connectivity from a remote place to another remote place? And it was putting two physical devices in place, right, to create a VPN tunnel. Right. So a lot of things were about VPNs and about, access, right. Making sure that you had, and everybody was using Active Directory primarily as a authentication source, but we didn't have a lot of multi-factor and all that. Like that wasn't a thing. Right. And so you had administrative privileges, but sometimes back then you were still using a single account that had, domain privileges that then you use as your everyday user account. If thinking about it in context to today's environment, it was considered the Wild Wild West back then. Like today, somebody coming into security today, thinking about the controls and everything of how we do security today and put them in a time machine and let them go back to what we were doing then. Yeah, I mean, I had a single account where I was both an admin to, do stuff in the firewall and do stuff here that I would also check my email with. Like, and today, that's absolutely no way would you ever think about letting somebody do that.
Yeah, apparently I was told that even turning on MFA for a lot of people was a struggle. Like, I think it wasn't like you walk up to someone, Larry, I think you need MFA, and you just basically say, yeah, I need MFA.
No, you had multi-factor back then was a token, right? It was a physical token, right?
Oh, the RSA token.
Was you had the RSA token. It was that little token that had numbers on it. And there were only a few people. Everybody didn't have it. MFA wasn't ubiquitous across every person. It was a few people had RSA tokens that they utilized for certain access to certain things. But it wasn't something that just, I'm going to have admin access to this. Well, where's my MFA token? No, it wasn't how it was. It was you had that purposefully, like, okay, how many people are we going to do MFA and have MFA? Yeah, it was very, very different. And now, mind you, and I'm talking about late 90s, early 2000s, right? As we got into the mid 2000s, MFA picked up, right? RSA token became a widespread thing. But, with tokens being lost and all this thing, people started realizing, okay, these physical tokens need to go away. And, that's when you started getting the software tokens and things of that nature. So it was a very, very interesting transition over time.
Wait, so I'm curious as well, what were some of the common challenges? Because you kind of have done 30 years in cybersecurity, just to paint a picture for people. Some of us have not done as much of CISO work. So just to paint a picture, what were some of the challenges for CISOs back then?
Yeah, so when you were running a cyber program back then, number one, most of what you dealt with was infrastructure-based things, right? You were running penetration tests, right? You still did that. You did vulnerability management, right? You were still running vulnerability. You still had patching issues. That was still the same. Yeah. But the bigger thing was, as a cyber executive back then, there was no visibility to the board. None, period, like at all. You were part of IT. That's where you lived. That's where you sat. And your biggest challenge was getting outside of that bubble, right, as a leader to get visibility into other areas of the business to help them understand, right? So we want to talk about user security, right? There was no such thing, right? We didn't have all the things that we had. AV, right? We had antivirus, right? We had that, but we didn't have all the UEBA and all the things that dictated how users behave. We didn't have as many education, right? The cyber awareness and all that wasn't as large a thing. You did some things. We had slides, that we would push out, and we would put posters around offices, but it wasn't nearly what cyber education and cyber awareness is today. And so from a challenge standpoint, it just, again, it went back to infrastructure, because you had all of this stuff that you didn't have the resources. We were still dealing with resources and people issues back then, because we didn't have enough staff. IT was constantly growing and building more. And, back then we had data centers everywhere, right? And so you're building data centers and you're putting servers and all, like, it was just big, but it all dealt around infrastructure. Infrastructure was everything.
And maybe that's how the cloud was so disruptive in this space as well. 30 years later, as we talk about cloud, how would you define like a cybersecurity program now in 2023, when like cloud and serverless and all these compute services are so prolific? What's your thinking when you think about a cybersecurity program that should exist in 2023?
Yeah, so in 2023, one of the first and foremost things that you have to think about in 2023 is visibility. From a security standpoint, you can't protect what you can't see, right? So every single cyber executive is trying to ensure that they've got visibility across all of their infrastructure, and that includes data, right? That includes, servers, whether they're in the cloud or whether they're on premise. That includes, end user devices, right? Because end user devices went from, just a laptop to a laptop and a tablet, and to a laptop, a tablet, and a phone, right? And so it's getting visibility to where everything is, both from a data perspective, from a device perspective, and from a human perspective, right? Where are people accessing from? Because now we've got, access rules where, like, if such and such access this data and they're in Russia, well, we've got to add more controls and more authentication mechanisms, right? That's the whole zero trust model, is trust but verify, or now don't trust, right? We started with trust but verify, but now it's don't trust at all. And then add these, what I call the defense in depth layers of authentication to verify where they are based on where they're at, based on, what they want to access, all these different rules. So it's just gotten very, very complicated. But number one for every security executive is visibility. They need to see everything. Hence APIs, right? Remember when we first moved to the cloud, we started interconnecting things. Nobody was talking about APIs. Nobody was talking about APIs from a security standpoint. We all talked about APIs from an interoperability standpoint. Hey, do you have an API? Do you have an open API? Oh, I have an open API. Can I connect your API? Right? That happened a lot. But security professionals were not looking at what's in the API. Well, how's the API built? What's happening in that communication? It wasn't even a discussion. Now there's how many dozens of API security companies, because we realize that's another threat vector. So now with all the APIs that exist out there in these cloud environments and how quick they are to connect, and everybody's got a marketplace, I need to understand what's inside those APIs, how the data is being transmitted, what data is being transmitted. Because if you add to that, now we've also got all of these governing rules, right? All of these regulations that are driving us to manage things differently, right? GDPR was a game changer, right? So, and that's just the precipice for many, many others that are going to start happening more.
I'm actually curious, just to kind of replay back what we were talking about earlier, where MFA was not a thing. Was NIST CSF like a thing back then?
There was no NIST CSF.
There was
NIST. So NIST existed, right? So some older people are going to remember this. We had the orange book, and we had the blue. Like they were dictionary-sized things that you use as this sort of governing mechanism to sort of help you understand. But you didn't really have. You use ISO. ISO was around, right?
Oh, right.
But ISO costs, but ISO costs money, right? You had to pay to get access to the ISO controls to be able to, utilize them. And a lot of organizations didn't want to pay. They didn't understand. We didn't understand the value of having a control set to use as your baseline marker to build, your cyber program. So yeah, it was a very different world.
Wow, I'm just trying to think, like, because you know how nowadays everyone pretty much tries and maps their, I guess, their road, in, for lack of a better word, for cybersecurity. I mean, in fact, my roadmap was mapped to the CSF as well, because everyone on the board understood it, everyone knew it. So this was not a thing back then for you guys, but now in the current world, in the cloud space, do you think these are still relevant, and do they still make sense?
They do, because they're adding and updating on a regular basis, and everybody's got some framework now, right? Cloud Security Alliance has a framework, right? NIST has frameworks. High Trust has frameworks. Everybody has got some form of a framework because they recognize that it's important, right?
So we were talking about the NIST CFA in today's day and age. Like,
yeah. So everybody's got frameworks. Everybody's got frameworks, and when you talk to cyber executives, everybody builds off a framework, and because a framework is understandable, a framework is reportable upon, right? It's things that and you can map it to regulatory things that you need to do. You can map it to policies. Everything starts with a framework. So when we talk today, even as it relates to the cloud, everything has to start with a framework to give you a frame of reference of what to do and why to do it, right? And if you look at CIS, if you think back, right, when CIS first started, it was, the CIS top 20 controls, right? Now, if you look at it, the CIS top 20 is now this layered thing that's got multiple levels, and it's evolved because they realized, yes, we were trying to give a basic starting point by saying, just these top 20 controls. Now they've gone and said, okay, we need to break this down a little bit more. But what they've done well is they've written it in plain English so the everyday human can understand and not have to decipher some of the wording that they use. So that's one of the things that people run into challenges with some of the NIST things and some of the ISO things is the language is a little nebulous.
Oh, right. Fair enough. So wait, to your point then, because I imagine a lot of our listeners and maybe people who are watching this as well, they're probably thinking that, when we talk about cloud security programs or cybersecurity programs, cloud security is just a small component of it. It is not the program itself.
Right.
How would you define, for people probably hearing the word cybersecurity program for the first time, how would you define a cybersecurity program?
Yeah. So for me, a cybersecurity program is basically about putting a program in place that is going to protect the business and what's important to the business, right? And that is data. Mm-hmm. That could be assets. There could be people, right? Depending on what the business is. And then building the components that align to the protection models that you need to put in place, right? So if you are a software company, well, your code is important to you. Whatever it is that you are writing for whatever application or business, that's what's important. So you need to have an application security team as part of your program, right? Application security is going to be part. Code security is going to be important. So you're going to have that as a mechanism as part of your program. You're still going to have to, based on the infrastructure that you utilize to run your company, if you're utilizing cloud, you're going to have a cloud security program, right? You're going to have an identity and access management function, right? That's managing authentication and things. So there's some staples, but then there's some nuances based on your business that you're going to have. And then every company, from my perspective, is going to have a governance, risk, and compliance function, right? Where they are doing a combination of vulnerability management, understanding what vulnerabilities look like in your organization and how you are mitigating them, right? They're looking at threat management, but they're also looking at what are the regulatory things that your organization must meet, right? Do you process credit cards? Then you've got PCI, do you have GDPR from a privacy standpoint? There's tons and tons of regulations. So I think GRC is also one of those staple functions that a lot of organizations need to have. And that's new. And like, I wasn't doing GRC, 25 years ago.
All right. There was no GRC because the government also didn't realize we need something like a regulatory body for this.
We weren't addressing it, right? There were regulations, right? So SOX has been around for a little bit now, but SOX wasn't around in 2000, right? We weren't doing Sarbanes-Oxley at that time. So as regulations have begun to be built and increased, right? HIPAA didn't exist then, right? So as these regulations started coming about, you started having to build a function to ensure that you're putting in controls to mitigate risk to the data that aligned to what these regulations were asking you to do.
That is interesting because I mean, you know how a lot of people complain about GRC at the moment, is GRC is too hard and blah blah blah. This didn't even exist a year. I mean, I guess in a lot of ways, it's also a great framework for someone who does not know much about cybersecurity to kind of get a kickstart, look at them and read them and all that. But on the flip side, the fact that it didn't even exist, I can't even imagine a world where it did not exist. Like today, I can't imagine any organization in any industry that is not governed by at least one regulation.
Right.
I just can't imagine. Like even data privacy is like by default, everyone in every country would have that.
Yep. And that didn't exist. We weren't worried about data privacy. It was not a thing. Right. But what's happened is storage got cheap, right? Yeah. Because remember, we went from spinning disks to solid state drives, right? So when we went from spinning disks, where you had a server that had all these disks, moving from spinning disks, right, basically exploded the entire IT infrastructure world. Yeah, because now you can have these large, databases, right? Because if you think about old school databases, you know how many disks sat in those damn things? Like the database teams, right, when they are going in and they're having to swap out there was a lot. It was a lot of work in mainframes. Oh man, that was a lot of work. It was a lot of work.
And it's funny. I think I don't think people appreciate who are like probably working directly in cloud at the moment. Don't even appreciate the level of complexity that would have gone with that as well. Because nowadays it's all software defined. Because I think almost like double tapping into the whole cloud security program that you were mentioning as well. Right. I feel like you know how you call the components like identity and access management, GRC, and threat management, vulnerability management. A lot of that somehow. I feel like cloud security programs kind of need to have all of that as well within it, or do you feel like it can exist of its own without all of that?
No. So cloud security is one component, right? You've got cloud security, you've got application security, you've got infrastructure security. All of these things exist, but all of the things that you talked about, so threat management, identity and access management, all of these things are bigger bucket items that exist across all of those. So if you've got cloud, if you've got infrastructure, right? If you've got applications, right? At application development, all three of those, you're going to have to do threat management because you need to understand the threat landscape as it relates to all of it. For all of those, you're going to have to do identity and access management, right? So for all of these things, right? They are just different components of a security program, right, as part of this.
And GRC would be the same as well? It would be across the board as well?
Across all of it, because you're going to have different regulatory things that you have to do for stuff that you're doing in the cloud based on the data and based on the country. You're going to have to do different things based on your infrastructure, right? Based on the data, based on the country, based on the users, right? So each one of them is going to have the same overarching pieces that you're having to do.
Interesting. And are they changing? You know how, I guess, the whole world of cloud, when it opened up, the whole change management system was questioned because it came from that era where change management was a thing, waterfall. Like, I think I get laughed at when I say waterfall methodology, because like, what the hell is waterfall methodology? And because I gave a talk once and I was asking who in the room has heard of waterfall methodology. No one raised their hands. And I was like, oh my God, I feel so old right now that no one even knows what that is. Right. I feel like cloud has kind of done the same to all these identity access management, GRC, vulnerability management as well. And I think, how do you feel cloud has affected this in changing what the norm was? And then maybe if you can double tap into the whole automation side of it as well, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so cloud has done a couple of things, because before cloud, there was process. Mm-hmm. Right? You had to do certain things before you could build something, right? Yeah. Because, an IT person couldn't just go rack a server themselves. They had to get someone to rack a server. They couldn't pull power. They couldn't do all. So, okay, now a server is racked. Well, they couldn't just go build an operating system, right? Somebody had to give them a build. Here's the build for what you need, right? So there was this step, and that's where change management came in. It was almost forced upon you because you didn't have the ability to just do everything. Yeah. In comes the cloud. Poof, right? Oh, I want to build a server. I want to kill a server. I want to, I want to stand this up. I want to kill, it's.
Yeah.
Right. So basically the cloud enabled IT at the speed of business. right? It enabled IT to move at a rate that the business moved. If the business said, hey, we got a new program that we want to implement, and we need to have this up in a month, like, boom, IT's got this up, and it's one person, right? This one person can go in and basically build an entire server infrastructure, stand it up, get all the stuff, put all the packages, just with a few clicks on their device. That killed change management, killed it.
Yeah,
right.
Totally.
And think about the component of cost management associated with that as well, right? Where before, in a data center, you could manage, well, we don't have any more physical servers. We need to buy some more 2U servers, and right. But our HVAC, right? So we're getting close, so we're going to have to, do this. Yeah, you don't do that in the cloud. You're not worried about HVAC. You're not worried about power consumption. Those are not things you even factor in. It's like, I need a server. Boop, there's your server. What
even
call
center as well. Like, I think call center used to be a thing for a while, but I don't hear that any much about call center.
No, because you know what? Some companies actually struggle. There's a whole market of companies that have been built around managing costs in the cloud. Basically, they're saying, listen, I can come into your company and I can cut your cloud spend by X percentage because I guarantee you're not managing it appropriately. There's an entire yes, right. Like, they literally are saying, we will come in, and what they do is they say, if we cut your cost, then you pay us a percentage of that. Whatever that percentage is we cut, right? If we cut it 50%, you pay us 10% of that 50%.
Okay, fair enough. And that's a good deal as well, because you're actually saving 50%. Yeah.
Right. You're saving 50%. So to give them 10% of that 50%, of course.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The cloud has built a whole new world of things and possibilities and everything else. But that's where automation comes in, right? So now what's starting to happen, right, is, okay, now this stuff can be built very easily. Well, what do we need to do to ensure that certain things happen when certain things get built in these environments, right? And that's where we've got to start focusing on and leaning on automation to ensure that we are governing these environments properly, right? So if something gets stood up, that there are automated checks and controls that begin to add, oh, you stood up, this type of server got stood up, oh, it needs this, bam, 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 bam. Because again, the stuff happens behind the scenes, and it's not somebody having to physically go do something. Cloud automation is like, it is all, it's really, really great capability. And when you think about how fast the threats are growing, how fast IT and business are moving, we've got to begin to accept automation more as a mechanism to help us versus the fear where, like, when we first started introducing automation into security, we were scared because, right, it's that whole, I had some conversations with CISOs about this, the theory of computers taking over, right? If I allow this to automate and it does something and it breaks everything else, and it's like, wait, okay, so one, automation is not a computer just thinking for itself, right? It is you, right? It's someone setting up a control that when this happens, right? It's if then else statements, right? Going back to development, which is where, if you think about technology, it started code, right? Back in the 70s, 80s, everything was code, and we didn't have this big infrastructure component. And then we moved into this big physical infrastructure piece. And now we're moving back, right? Away from the big infrastructure back to code, right? Because now coding language has changed and evolved so much, right? What you can turn code into now, and because data is so cheap, and you've got these data lakes, and right, it's the circle, right? And so I'm wondering, with quantum computing, is the circle going to come back around? Like, it's going to be very interesting. But automation is the only way for security teams today to stay ahead just a little bit.
Maybe the team skill set also need to be updated with that mentality. Because to your point, for someone who was just doing infrastructure back in the day, where you just need to remember the server name or the URL on how to get to the server name, like the sysadmin role, traditional sysadmin role has transformed into DevOps and platform engineers and stuff as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And we have to change along with it as well.
Right. Listen, I'm going to tell you, there was not a sysadmin that I've ever had, security or IT, that knew code back in the 90s and back in 2000s. They did coding. They had no idea of what coding was. Today, right? Good sysadmins know code. They can script. They can do a lot of things that was not something you even thought about doing back in the day.
Yeah. I mean, I remember the whole even NIST used to be like a certificate, Microsoft certified. That is like, oh my God. That used to be a thing. If you had that, a job was guaranteed.
Listen, I've got a story. I tell people this story, and this story is weird. It's the story that caused me to be anti-certification. So my garbage man, right? This is, probably 2004.
Yeah.
My garbage man, right? I was throwing out all of these servers. I had a bunch of servers at home. I had like Sun Microsystem server. Like I had all sorts of crap. At one point I had 26 servers in my home, right?
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Wow.
Right. And you wouldn't even think about that today, right? You can't fathom that today, but I had 26 servers in my basement, right? So I'm throwing all this stuff out. He's like, "Oh, you're in computers?" I'm like, yeah. Right. He's like, "Yeah, man, I'm about to do that too. I just got my MCSE." Right. And so for him, right, there's nothing against him, but back then, if you got that certification, now you were it.
Yeah,
just by getting the certification. You had no background in it. You had no nothing. You just go get that certification. It was like, bing, right? And I was like, wait, what? And so everybody started doing it. And that happened in cyber, right? Everybody started saying, oh, let me just go get this certification and then I'll be, and I'm like, wait, like certifications are supposed to be about aptitude. They're supposed to be a mechanism to measure aptitude, and that's it. But we started making them a job requirement. We started making them a precursor, right, to employment. So then people felt, okay, I get this now. The world is my oyster. And we made people feel that way. So I basically said, I'm out on certification. I will never get, I'm not going to get a certification. And here I am 30 years later, still not a single one.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I found that this thing hasn't changed with certification even till today. Like, I think there's a lot of cloud certification that goes around, and people are told you get the certificate because to your point, they're told, hey, you should look at a job that's available. They look at the jobs have the certification written on it. And okay, so to qualify for this job, I need to have the certificate, which is, to your point, it's a false information, because I think some of the conversation, so we're running like a cloud bootcamp at the moment, which is a free one on YouTube. And a lot of questions around fundamentals of IT, like what is a server? How do two servers connect on a network? Why would two things talk on a network? They're not taught any of that, but they have an AWS certification.
Right. It's alphabet soup, right? So you see people, and here's the reality. I know people who went and got their CISSP and just because they're good test takers. Like they know nothing about security, right? They've never done it. They've been salespeople their whole life, but because they went and got their CISSP, now they seem credible. No. And to be clear, I love ISC Squared, their partner, their CEO Claire, their past CEO David, good friends of mine. But it's the premise that someone who gets a certification now knows everything. No. No.
It's definitely marketed incorrectly as well. And I think maybe to bring it back to the CISOs as well, is there like I was going to say a playbook, but more like, how GRC as well, which is not spoken about enough. Like last month, we had an episode on FedRAMP, like Alexis from AWS came in. She spoke about the whole importance of automation in FedRAMP and why people have this false assumption that if you have a government client as a customer, 2 days later or 2 months later, you can get a certification FedRAMP. That's not as easy. And I think a lot of it was automation shifting left. And I wanted to get your perspective on the whole GRC automation in space. Where do you see that kind of play out? And does shift left play a role in this as well?
Yeah, so shifting left, we've tied shifting left to automation because that's sort of where we had to go, right? So if you think about the security paradigm as a whole, we've been a manually driven entity, right? From a security standpoint. Everything was penetration tests, manual, right? Risk assessments. I'm coming to walk. I've got this sheet of paper. We're going to walk around. It's manual. Meeting government and whatever regulatory requirements, manual. It's paper, right? It's okay. Hey, I need these attestations. Go take this screenshot. Go do this. Store it in this folder. Oh, we're going to create this Excel spreadsheet. Everything is absolutely manual. And the reality is, in order to stay manual, if your requirements grow, right? And you're doing them manually, that means the amount of tasks that you're going to have to do to complete them is going to grow. Well, if you aren't getting more people in, and we know that the industry is having an issue getting people, right? We aren't training enough people. We aren't educating enough people to come into the industry. The only thing we can do is move towards automation, right?
Yeah.
And so that is where the shift left culture and the shift left, mantra has sort of come from, is like, let's shift left. And it had to start somewhere. It started in security operations, because if you go back to how security operations started and how it was in its infancy, it was, you had people who were monitoring and looking at logs. And I will never forget, I had a team, I had a SOC back when I was at the Pentagon that looked at logs. And what they did was they went and pulled logs from systems and they manually looked at logs. And then they started writing scripts to try and pull out certain things from log, right? It was the most tedious, insane thing in the world, but that's what we did. That's how you had to do it. Then the SIM came along, and the SIM, you could write rules that would then correlate activities. This happened and this happened. Oh, we might need to look deeper into that. So there was some little automation just based on creating correlation rules. All right, great. The industry is starting to accept it a little bit. All right, great. We're moving. So fast forward, and I will never forget this moment. So everybody was getting into the SIM space. Cisco had gotten into the SIM space, and they built automation into their SIM. And so I'm at One Penn Plaza in New York City with a room full of CISOs and Cisco talking about their SIM and this automation, and the room exploded. We're not going to let that make an ACL change in our router. What? No way we'll let that, right? We're not going to allow that to make a firewall rule change. No way, because everybody was in this mindset that, if that does that and it breaks the business, right? And an organization I was CISO at, we had 345 firewalls globally.
Oh
right?
my God. Yeah.
Right. So when you think about automation in that and implementing a firewall rule in one of those firewalls that then, impacts a countries being able to talk to each other from a business standpoint, like, whoa, right. So we were very fearful of that. But at that time, we had people, and we had, had a SOC that had access to these 345 firewalls that could go in and, remote into it and make the change, or go into the semantic console and make it, right? So we were still in this manual mindset, but SIM, right, because data was starting to get bigger, attacks were starting to get broader. Okay, we were allowing it there, and the SIM began to bring some automation in. So then SOAR happened, because again, on the operation side, right, data flow, data, and we can't hire enough people, and we need to have them, instead of focusing on all of these millions and millions of alerts, allow them to narrow in. So we started saying, okay, right, security orchestration. Wow, this is cool. This is a good idea, right? We can actually automate some things and let some simple things just happen, and then let our analysts dig in and spend time on things that matter. And so as we did that, it's like, okay, we started getting the automation piece, and it was like, okay, let's shift left to automate more. Let's shift left. And so now we have gotten to the point where automation, we recognize the value of it. We recognize it. So now it is okay, right? A lot of people are starting to say, so let's look at other areas where we are manual, right? Let's look at some other areas where we spend a lot of time and resource doing things manually that we may be able to also automate and shift left a little bit, right? And that's right now where we're at with GRC. We're starting to say, hey, right, you're trying to, how do you meet your regulatory requirements today? Paper. Everybody, I don't care who they are.
Screenshot taking is a thing.
It is, right? And there's some in the financial services space, even in the late 2000s, they had teams of people, dozens upon dozens of people, just to meet the regulatory requirements, just to deal with audits, just to deal with the information gathering to meet the regulatory requirements, right? So when you think about that, and it's just growing, we know GDPR again blew the walls off, and now there are multiple entities, multiple countries, and multiple states in the US that are coming up with their own flavor of a GDPR type thing, right?
That's
Because
right.
they want to protect their particular citizens because of the data sprawl and how much companies are now grabbing data about users via everything from, right, from when you're on your computer and your browser with Google to, your phone. You get on your
Yeah.
phone and you say something, and the next thing you know, you got all these ads popping up for this thing that you mentioned to your wife 2 days ago. You're like, how is right? So
Yeah.
with all this data that's being grabbed, people are starting to say, like, there are more entities coming up with, well, okay, we need a law, we need some sort of rule, we need some sort of regulation, right, to force companies and push and move. And so that's going to continue. That's not going to change. So if that's not going to change, there's going to be more of those coming. That's a manual process. Why? Like, it's just time to start saying, you know what? We've got all these data points, right? If we're trying to meet a regulation, regulations are based on what? Controls and standards,
Yeah.
right? If we can measure those controls and standards, why don't we just utilize the tool sets that we already have in place, right? Where we're manually grabbing screenshots, we're manually grabbing data to just automate. Let's grab that data, right? Like utilizing APIs and other connectors that are built into these technologies already. Let's start grabbing them. Let's start pulling that in an automated fashion, and let's work towards real-time compliance. Because if you think about it, just like penetration tests have evolved. Penetration tests used to be like, okay, I got to get a penetration test, so I get it in, November of this year. Okay, we get our report, and we know we're going to have it again in November of next year. You know what happens? Every single organization, they will deal with one or two major findings in that pen test report, and then the other ones, it's not till October of the next year that they're like, oh shit, we got to have the pen test again next month, and we didn't finish all these other things. Let's go through. We got to try, right? Because you don't want the board, and you don't want leadership to see that 80% of the findings from last year are still there this year, right? But you never got to them, right? So now penetration testing is becoming automated. They are automating and routine and continuous, right? So it is just time for us to look at this very manual thing. And I think the industry as a whole has just said, okay, let's get visibility into all these manual processes and things that we're doing, right? What can we do better? And regulations and meeting our regulatory mandates is the next phase.
I think that, one thing that keep coming up, and I think when we were talking about this, in one of the companies that I was working with earlier, we had this challenge. I think we were trying to do ISO 27001, and we were trying to do the automation part. One of the challenges we had was the auditor just would not accept that as an evidence. And do you find that the industry itself has not evolved as well? Like, I think there's one side to people like you, me, other CISOs and practitioners who are trying to bring the new world in. But then on the other side, the auditors themselves, and I don't know if it was like they're not being told or they're just unaware, oblivious to the fact that, hey, the world is changing. Like, do you find there's a challenge from that perspective as well?
Yeah, so that is a challenge, and that's a challenge that organizations are facing, but they have to bring the auditors forward, right? Like that's an upfront conversation, right? As you're building out your automation, as you're building out, so one of the things is auditors, again, they operate in the way they know. So when you introduce something that they don't know, with automation, it's not necessarily about changing the data, because you can still give them printed reports, right? You can still give them things that they're looking for, right? It's that they don't know. For those auditors who want to see, right, oh, well, what's your attestation? And they want to see this physical thing. That's where sometimes it's like, hey, so listen, right? Yes, here's the report, here's the thing, right? And you have to help them move forward. You have to help them understand, right, where the industry is going. And you have to help them, because for auditors, there's value in them accepting this as well. Because for them, it's this time associated with it, right? They're not, when they come in to do an audit, they're not billing a per hour, right? So they don't want to extend the time. They'd like to get through the audit as quickly as possible as well, right? Because it allows them to do more the quicker they can go through an audit, right? But what happens is, because they don't understand it, and most of the time, organizations who are moving towards being automated in this area, they aren't communicating that before with the auditor. So when the auditors come in, they've got an expectation in their mind of what they expect to see. And when you give them something that's outside of that, they're like, wait, what is this? No, that's not what I need. I need this, right? So you got to make sure as an organization that when you are moving towards automation in this space, that you are communicating with your auditing entity, right, up front, so you can level set their expectations. So when they arrive, they know what they're going to be looking for.
Yeah, I think, and I was told by a fellow CISO colleague as well, what we ended up doing is that because we're the ones paying money for the audit, we can pick and choose the auditor coming in as well. If you find that it's going to be a challenge, you can ask for another one. Because to your point, last thing you want is after putting so much effort of automation and doing it, you're still taking screenshots. You're like, that's just silly.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. And to your point then, so we kind of spoke about both sides, the auditor themselves, who, again, I feel like there's definitely a battle, but I'm sure they get there eventually. Then there is the side of the CISOs themselves trying to kind of implement this and trying to work with it. Are we saying our side, I guess the consumer side of this problem, the GRC teams who are listening to this, they have to learn some kind of coding as well? Because it sounds like automation is like, GRC traditionally has been known as a checklist, a more thought-provoking, I don't mean it in a derogatory way, but it's more like, what's the checklist? You just give me the checklist and that'll be the end of it.
Right.
And I'll just match it.
Right.
I feel like what you're trying to say and what a lot of people are trying to say, and it'll be awesome if you kind of say it in your own words as well, instead of me just repeating it to the world, but they kind of need to know some kind of coding as well, because they have APS access to what you said. Is there a change coming from that perspective as well?
Yeah, so the entire industry of cyber is going to have to understand some aspects of coding methodology. They don't need to understand code per se. They need to understand code methodology, right? GRC people aren't going to be coders. Putting an API or connecting something via API is not really coding per se, because the applications are going to have, right? You're basically picking something from a market, right?
Yeah.
But they need to understand the logic. Right, they're going to have to understand the logic of code, right? Both the auditors and the GRC professionals are going to have to understand, okay, well, what is this grabbing? How is it grabbing it, right? So that they can understand, right, this data set is what's being used to meet this control of this particular regulation. Is this data from this system in this environment, is this component is being grabbed to say, yes, we are meeting this, right? So they'll have to understand the logic of it, but they won't have to understand it per se as it relates to being able to build it.
And maybe to the CISOs who work, in that Pentagon office that you were there, and they were just basically shouting about automation. How can you do this? Will fail, whatever. What would your, I guess, statement would be for them, specifically listening about, after listening to all of this? Yeah, I hear you, Larry, but I still feel uncomfortable talking about automation from GRC perspective. Like, what do you feel, how you mentioned the whole computers taking over the world? Is this one of those similar scenarios, and they just basically need to understand that, hey, someone is writing it, we just need to work with them? Or is it like, how do you kind of bring them onto this side of the fence? Is kind of where I'm coming from.
Here's the reality. Everything transitions, and you either get on board or you fall behind, right? So everybody who didn't take advantage of SOAR and wasn't using SOAR, I guarantee is trying everything they can to use SOAR today, because nothing has changed as it relates to bringing more people into the industry. We're never going to catch up there, right? So we've got to find ways to be more efficient, right, than we are, period. And every single cybersecurity executive is looking for ways to be more efficient in how they do their work. And you've got to take advantages of the opportunities that get brought to you to do it. In this world of governance, risk, and compliance that is highly paper-driven, right, it's an opportunity, right? Because if you think about it, there's less risk in automating this than there was in the security operations space, right? Because in the security operations space, the automation there could break business, right? You could implement a control, you could do something, you could miss something. But we've been successful at it. So in space that is paper driven, that doesn't necessarily directly impact the business's ability to operate, why would you not?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think, I feel like there's almost like a playbook here. If you were to kind of think about from a perspective of the people in between as well, there's the CISOs and there's the VPs or directors as well. We have them as listeners onto the conversation as well. From their perspective, is there like top 3 things they should have in their cloud security playbook, I guess, in your mind, where GRC, I feel like they would definitely be including that into their automation playbook? Or, I mean, I'm not going to answer, but are there things that come to your mind where people should think of at least these three things, or as principles or as topics they should cover when they build a playbook for their cloud security program?
Yeah, so when it comes to cloud security specifically, right? So number one is focus on visibility, right? Making sure that you can see everything. Number two, focus on authentication, right? Layers of authentication based on what people are going to do. And then last is automate, automate, automate. The cloud is the precipice for the enablement of automation. It just is.
Yeah.
Right. And so because of the interconnectivity between everything that can happen, automate everything that you can. If you've got visibility,
yeah,
you've got proper authentication set up across all of these different things, you automating it will save you money because you won't have to hire as many people, right? It'll actually be more secure because you won't have carbon-based life forms in there making mistakes, right? And I love people because I am one, right? But at the end of the day, carbon-based life forms, us clicking buttons, are the things that basically enable mistakes to happen, right? Whether because I'm tired, I didn't sleep well last night, I got into an argument with my wife, my kids pissed me off, the dogs are barking, whatever, right? I am more prone to mistakes than some automation script, right? Now, you've got to have visibility, and visibility dives into, as you automate, seeing it and being able to measure and track that the automation is happening the way you expect. Don't just automate and turn your back and walk away thinking that now because I've got it set to automate that it's always going to happen. And so you still need to monitor and manage it and make sure that it's operating the way you expect it to. But now you're not performing the task. And if you think about, man hours, right? Once you automate, the amount of time that you put into just managing the automation versus the time you would put in actually doing the function that the automation is doing, it's not even close. So those are the three things in the cloud that I think every organization should be focused on.
Awesome. No, thank you so much for that. That's pretty awesome. I think that was kind of like the end of the technical question that I had as well, because I think that covers, hopefully, my hope is towards the end of this, when they've heard all of this, they understand how privileged we are to be able to live in a world where we're complaining about frameworks instead of not having frameworks in general.
Right.
Like, the fact that people can still use compliance as a stick to get their work done in security versus a time when this was not even a thing. I'm definitely better to being in this time rather than that time, although I'm sure the challenges would have been much different and maybe even more challenging. Yeah, I'm hoping that they'll be able to get away with it, but I think get away with the understanding that, okay, this is automation is going to be the key moving forward, whether it's GRC, whether it's anything else. And hopefully some of the CISOs who are listening to this as well are able to kind of, be brave and walk forward with that step as well.
Yep, and being brave. I actually like that. That's a great statement. Be brave. Be bold.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I think a lot of us have done it, and I think it's definitely possible. It just basically reach out to Larry or reach out to me as well. I've got 3 questions that are non-technical as well, so people can get to know you a bit more as well. Well, first one being, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on technology, like cloud or governance, compliance, and CISO work?
Yeah, so for me, there's a couple of things. One, I've got 8 children, but there are basically 2 left in the house. And so a lot of time with my wife, my 2 dogs and the kids, right? But my other thing is motorcycles. I love riding motorcycles. So I've got a nice big Harley that I love to just go out and get on and just ride. And then outside of that, it's really just as I like being outdoors. And so we walk a lot, we hike, we love to travel. So we're constantly trying to find new adventures and things that we can do either as a family or Santa and I as a couple, where we're just outside. We like engaging with people and just being outside in the world.
That's pretty awesome. That's a very good thing to have as well. I'm a bit envious of your Harley Davidson though, but I think definitely it would be one day, because my wife is definitely not interested in me motorcycle riding. She's like, anyway,
mine's not either, because it makes me happy. It makes her happy, right?
Oh, so that. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So she literally has said she will never get on it, right? She says, but if it makes me happy, it makes her happy. So she's supportive of it.
Yeah, same. Second question, what is something that you're proud of, but it is not on your social media?
That's not on my social media that I'm proud of. So, okay, you know what? So it's an interesting question. So for me, that's not on my social media because my kids and my wife and dogs are all over my social media. I'll say my mother. And I say that because without my mother, I'm not here. And let me explain that. Right. Yeah. Our mother birthed us. Right. And so, yeah, that's obvious. But for me, it goes to my mom, despite how I grew up, the situations that I was involved in with my dad, with my family and my father, and the craziness that was life then, she was always providing affirmation to my sister and I that you could be anything. You can do anything. You are great. You are smart. You right. She always gave affirmation despite living in utter turmoil around our life, in our neighborhoods, and everything else. She, right, and she still to this day, right, gives that affirmation. And despite, she doesn't make any money. She still, lives, an underserved community, that type of thing. But she still provides affirmation, and she set the example. Right. And even with my father and everything my dad did, and the good, the bad, the ugly, to this day, right. And God rest his soul, he got murdered when he was 40. When he was 41, I was 20. Right. She's never said a bad word about him. Never. Wow. Not once in my entire life. Not one time has she ever spoken a bad word about him. So she, for me, set an example for me of who I want to be, what I want to be. Right. And that's allowed me to achieve.
That's awesome. And and I hope she's watching this interview. And she does, I think, definitely shout out to her as well for doing the right thing by her kids as well, no matter what the circumstances.
Yep.
She's amazing.
Because a lot of times, as parents, the situation dictates a lot of things. And our kids become, a part of that, right? And so how she was able to keep me and my sister above the fray and continue to affirm. And so my sister's successful as well. And we look back, and my mother is, the precipice for that.
That's definitely an amazing lady, though. Yeah, I should probably do an episode on her, specifically after that, on your podcast with your wife. With the last question that I have, what's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share?
Ooh, I don't know if I have one. Like, so my wife and I, Shannon and I, literally eat a lot at a lot of different places, and we go and we get tapas. Like, we will order 3 or 4 different appetizers, and then one meal that we just share everything. And so I don't know if I have a single place. And I'll say this. Maybe one of the most amazing meals that I ever had was actually in Santa Fe, New Mexico, at this apothecary restaurant. I think it was called the Apothecary or something like that. It was literally mind-blowing, right? So it was like the overall experience was good, but the cocktail that they made, like everything was just so utterly unique. So that one, and then there's a restaurant in Livingston, Montana that we went to downtown that is also an experience type restaurant, and they come in and it's a pre-menu menu.
Right.
And they come in and it's like 6 courses, and with each course they pair a wine with the meal. So you get a glass of wine that goes with, right? And they give you like a 3-ounce pour for each course of the meal. Oh, absolutely. Like, those are probably my top 2 meals of all time that I've ever had.
Wow. That's like, I'm definitely feeling hungry now. Even it's like the odd time at my end, but that was kind of like the question that I had. Thank you so much for answering this as well. Where can people find you on the internet if they have more questions around the whole GRC automation, or how can they do the whole CISO playbook or CISO cybersecurity programs?
Yeah, so for me, it's easy. Larry Whiteside Jr. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, right? And I try and keep it easy, right? Everything is Larry Whiteside Jr. So I don't try and get all crazy and get, create these unique, weird names. No, Larry Whiteside Jr. You Google it, look it up on any of the social platforms, and that's me.
Awesome. And I'll include that in the show notes as well. But thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciate this. I'm going to have to see a few more conversations over here to bring you back onto the show as well. But thank you so much for your time. And for everyone else who's listening or watching, we will see you soon in the next episode. Thank you, Larry.
Thanks. Later.
Thanks.